Thank you for the introduction. Hello, my name is Fabio Gigi. I'm very sorry I could not make it to Seattle, but the funding situation, such as it is in the UK at the moment, really no longer allows for extravagant travel. I would like to thank Caroline Hirasawa and Benedetta Lomi for inviting me, and I hope you don't mind this somewhat one-dimensional, if not one-directional presentation. Here we go. I would like to start with an example from my fieldwork. When I was a visiting researcher at the University of Tokyo, a friend introduced me to her teacher of traditional Japanese dance. Doing fieldwork, tidying up gomiyashiki, or rubbish houses, in other words hoarders in Japan, I sometimes went to see her practice dance at her teacher's kekoba just to rest my eyes and see something beautiful. Indeed, her teacher was a kind of underground legend in the very traditional world of Japanese dance. She had declined to become iemoto, the head of a school, of a well-known dance style, because it would stunt her own creative development, as she said. Having seen her sparse and intensely beautiful performances at the National Theatre, I was quite surprised when I first visited her house, which contained a small stage where she taught her students. The kekoba was austere and empty, but on the side of the visitors it was overflowing with stuffed animals, mostly of Disney descent. This was somewhat incongruous with the teacher's strictly ascetic aesthetics, but I did not dare to ask her such questions at that early stage of our acquaintance. Later I asked several of her students, and they all said the same thing. Some of her younger students must have given her a stuffed animal as a gift early on, maybe as a souvenir from a trip to Disneyland. Then subsequent generations would look at the animal that was prominently displayed in the kekoba and make inferences about the teacher's taste, and so over the years the stuffed animals started to pile up. When asked what to do about them, the teacher at one point said quite expressively, "But I cannot throw them away." This brought home to me very pointedly the way that often in Japanese social life one is exposed more or less helplessly to the good intentions of others, or even more radically, to the image that others have of oneself. Material culture materializes the relationships one has in a particular way, and to get rid of the thing in this context would be to deny the relationship. Now this is especially interesting in a Japanese context because of course you have bi-yearly gift seasons where a large amount of gifts are exchanged that are not personalized, but these souvenirs that you bring home from traveling are personalized things that they cannot be passed on, and in that way they're very different from the chugen and sebo gifts that you exchange in the middle of the year or towards the end of the year. Personalized gifts in that sense are what Kopitov calls terminal commodities. The idea of the terminal commodities he put forward in his 1986 article on the social life of things, and it has become a kind of founding text for material culture in many ways. The idea is that commodities are not simply produced as commodities. A commodity state is what happens to a things. This, of course, is Apadurais' larger argument. So things can become commoditized, and they can also become decommoditized in the course of their social life. And depending on what kind of relationships that they materialize, the status of the thing also changes. Now, what is interesting to me about the idea of terminal commodities is, in a sense, the double meaning that is contained in the notion of terminal. What Kopitov means with it is that there is a certain trajectory that the thing ends up in from where it can no longer be traded as a commodity, but of course terminal also refers to the social death, you could say, of the thing. So I think there is a tension here that Kopitov does not really address, and I would like to think about that in the talk I'm about to give to you. Now, Kopitov suggests two ways of creating a state of terminal commoditization. One is singularization, The other is sacralization. Singularization is fairly simple and straightforward. It simply means that a mass-produced thing is taken out of circulation and turned into a personal possession, for example. So personalization would be one way of singularization. The mass aspect of the thing, in a sense, is turned into something personal that is then imbued with memories or sentimental attachment, and therefore it ceases to be a commodity. The other way is sacralization. This is a bit more complicated because the sort of religious terminology that he uses may be slightly misleading. It is the same process. Something that may or may not be mass-produced, usually it isn't, is taken out of circulation and revalued as symbolic of a larger structure. So, for example, the paintings in the National Gallery are no longer commodities, because they come to symbolize the nation, the cultural memory or the cultural heritage of the nation, and of course as such is tied to the states. And the same is true for religious objects. They can no longer be disposed of because they have this link to the transcendental. If they could be, of course, that would throw quite some doubt on the existence of the transcendental in the first place. So it is, in a sense, to think about the disposal of sacred object is a quite dangerous thing to do. Now, when I say that there are two meanings contained in the notion of terminal, I need to go a step back and first address the notion of methodological fetishism, which is what Appadurai suggested as sort of the core paradigm for material culture studies. Methodological fetishism is simply the idea that we follow the object rather than the sort of the people who own them in the first place, because of course commodities can move very swiftly. They can move across borders, they can move from production to consumption quite easily, something that people often cannot do. So in order to understand the trajectory of a thing, when it becomes a commodity and when it ceases to be a commodity, it's important to follow the trajectory of the object. And this is what Appadurai calls methodological fetishism. We pretend, in a sense, that the object has an agency of its own and that it moves by itself. But there is, of course, a problem here when you think of the notion of terminal commoditization, because it's precisely, in a sense, in the moment of the terminus, the end point of the trajectory, that we need to reconsider the social relationships that are engendered by the object with people. So yes, the gift in the earlier example, in a sense, is because it's personalized, it becomes symbolic of the student, and therefore to throw away the gift or to dispose of it would deny, in a sense, the existence of the student-teacher relationship. But what happens if the teacher were to pass away, for example? So the term terminality in this sense is not only on the side of the object, but we also, of course, need to take into account the terminality on the side of the subject, on the side of the owner. And this is really what I would like to talk about today. And we'll start, this is quite a good example. I think this is from the homepage of a service that specializes in Ihin Shori, the idea that you have to, professional care of the objects, and it is advertised here very cleverly with the phrase Tengoki e no ohikoshi no otetsudai, the idea that, well, we'll help you move into heaven. And you can see sort of the illustration here suggesting that there is indeed an afterlife and that your things, in a sense, can come with you to a certain degree. And it says further down, Nihon Hatsu no Ihin Kuyo Senyo Hall. So it's a specialized hall where for memorial services for things that were left by people. Now, in my fieldwork on gomiyashiki, on hoarding and the disposal of stuff in general, I came across this firm, and I got into contact with them because I thought this was a very interesting example. And they were very friendly, but of course they didn't really want me to find out where the things actually go, because in a sense this is the magic here that is presented. You pay us to get rid of your stuff, or the stuff of your relatives, of your mother who's passed away, and we will take care of it. It won't give you a sense of guilt. We will follow sort of a ritual procedure that will, in a sense, cleanse you of that guilt, but also we will take care of the stuff, and the stuff will no longer be there, and we'll create this illusion that it has moved to heaven with the deceased person. Now this is quite interesting because, again, terminal here acquires a slightly different sense. It is the disappearance of the object, the disappearance of the personal possession that is then construed as having moved sort of into the transcendent together with the deceased person. It becomes much more complicated when you start thinking about stuffed animals and puppets and dolls specifically. So this is very interesting. This is Ningyo Kuyosai. This is a big memorial service for stuffed animals that are increasingly popular. They're not a traditional thing. There's always a caveat. I have to point this out to you. Even Kuyo memorial services for needles, for example, or for glasses that have been around since the late Edo period, they are not really very old customs, and these are fairly new. And again, I had the chance to talk to some of the organizers. It's very interesting that this is actually not organized by the temple. This was organized by a local sort of Chonaikai organization, and they rented a truck and went round so people could throw out their stuffed animals, and they were completely overwhelmed by the number of stuffed animals that they received. And so they asked the local priest the priest of the local temple to perform a memorial service. And the picture was taken at that time. You can see quite a motley crew of different things. There's some traditional dolls at the back, but mostly modern stuffed animals. Again, of course, my first question was, well, where do these things go? And again, this was the question that really, if you answer that, in a sense, you take away from the illusion that this really is a kuyo. This is another example. This is the doll memorial service at Shoryakuji in Nara. You can see here a great host of traditional dolls used for the Hinamatsuri, but also a striking line of Western dolls, the first line, and also at the back. Now, the Shoryakuji in Nara suggests, of course, the veneer of tradition and authority, but this is, in spite of the appearance, a very recent thing. It takes place every year on the 9th of March, but has only started in Heisei Gannen, in the first year of the era Heisei, so 1989. So it is a very recent thing. And increasingly temples sort of start catering to the concern that people have with how to get rid of things that they can't really just throw away. And again, the sort of the formula is always the same. The idea that these things need to disappear in a way that the person who owned them before can think of them as sort of going into transcendence and overcoming this material world and going someplace else, which of course includes the idea that they have to disappear. Now, how can you make a commodity disappear? This is the big question, not only for the owner of dolls and puppets, but of course also for garbage disposal more broadly. And I would like to introduce you to some ingenious ways of doing that. Now, this is the Hinanagashi at the Awajima Shrine in Wakayama. I actually haven't witnessed this myself. This is an image taken from the Sankei newspaper. from 2015, and you can see here beautiful elaborate Hina dolls are loaded onto small boats and then they are launched into the sea. The current takes them out to sea, and that's where they simply cease to be. And this is very interesting. Hina nagashi means simply letting the dolls float or letting them be carried away by the current, and again the idea is that they will disappear and they won't be able to return, and therefore all the bad feeling associated with it is gone. Also because there is sort of the imagery, although I talked to a few people and you get quite different answers when you ask about what happens to the dolls, but there is originally the idea that they go to Fudaraku, the sort of the Western paradise that sometimes is said to be sort of in offshore the coast, the Japanese coast. So they are let to float away on the current, and therefore they disappear. Terminal, they remain, but in a sense their disappearance allows them to be construed as almost transcendental and therefore semi-sacred objects. Another more dramatic way of doing so is by decommoditizing dolls by fire. So basically to burn them, which is again very close to human burial and in a sort of a ceremonial context. This is a picture I took from the internet. I didn't take it myself, but there's a very dramatic moment where here an Ichimatsu doll, sort of these not life-size but quite large dolls that usually are given to children by the grandparents in order to keep the children from harm. The idea being that the doll acts as a proxy for the child, so everything evil, all the illnesses, all the bad entities in a sense, they attach themselves to the doll, and therefore the doll in a sense has to be destroyed. It becomes more personalized as it gets older, and you often hear people say that actually the doll starts to resemble the child as it grows up. So there is some kind of uncanny life present here, and I sort of follow the work of Inge Daniels, who wrote a wonderful article about what her informant said about dolls. Dolls are scary, and they are scary because in a sense they accrue life as part of being possessed by someone. And again, possession sort of here is not only ownership, but it implies something that goes beyond that, literally something that is closer to spirit possession. There is some kind of exchange, and all the bad things that don't go or don't affect the child affect the doll. So the doll becomes a container for all these negative energies, which is the reason why you can burn them. And again, burning is a very sort of tragic, no, not a tragic, it's a very dramatic moment, because of course you'd expect the sort of the very life-like doll to scream run, but they don't. They just simply stay there and slowly burn until they are no more. So this is, again, it's the model is taken from human funeral, and they are let go by being destroyed. This of course also destroys the value that they embody, and this is sort of a very important conundrum. And there is another way of doing that again is a very recent invention. This is again a picture from the Shoryakuji in Nara, where originally they used to burn dolls, but now the ritual is inversed, and this is really very interesting. What is burnt, as you can see here, the monks are throwing pieces of wood into the fire, and on the piece of wood is the name of the owner of the doll, and these names are burnt in the presence of the dolls. You can see them here in the background, or presumably a selection of dolls. So in a sense you could argue, rather than to destroy the doll and therefore to ensure that the link to the owner, the previous owner, is severed, here the dolls are undergoing the same ritual. It is their attachment to their owner that is extinguished by burning the names of the owner in their presence. Now, interestingly, of course, this leaves the doll intact. And when you think about the considerable value that these dolls have, it makes perfect sense. So they are terminal commodities up to the point at which the relationship with their owner is severed. And then they can be recommoditized because they are antique dolls and they can, in a sense, be passed on and sold on. But the important thing for the person who owns them is to be not aware of that. The relationship with the doll ends here. Whatever happens to it afterwards is what you don't want to know about. And people pay, of course, the temple to undertake these services. They pay for disposal that make these dolls, in a sense, go away, that mark their absence. So to return to the question of terminality, is it really until death do us part? From the perspective of the owner, clearly yes. But the problem with material possessions is precisely that their trajectory is out of joint with ours. The doll, as a material artifact, is well equipped to live on beyond the human lifespan. Dolls can of course be passed down as heirlooms, but increasing numbers of people find them to be a creepy presence that again cannot be get rid of once it has been let into the house. Better to terminate the doll in a safe manner, that is, in a way that makes it impossible for the doll to come back. Different from human beings, the terminal commodity status for things is never really terminal. The possibility of return is always left open. Memorial services for dolls and other objects are salient in precisely this context. They facilitate the establishment of clear boundaries. By making sure that the doll is recommoditized and returns to the sphere of commercial exchange, they also make sure that the doll does not return to haunt those who want to get rid of it. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, please write to fg5@soas.ac.uk.